After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, Hannah saw it, a dark shape rising from the plain, square and solid. The cabin. Real walls. A real roof. Not canvas, not temporary. Something that would stand against the storm. The man dismounted near the door and pushed it open. It swung inward with a creak of hinges, revealing darkness inside. He stepped through first, and a moment later Hannah heard the strike of a match, saw the flare of light. The man lit a lamp sitting on a rough wooden table, and warm yellow light spilled through the doorway. "Come in," he called, his voice carrying over the storm. Hannah crossed the threshold with her children and stopped, overwhelmed by the simple reality of being inside, under a roof, surrounded by walls that didn't move. The cabin was small, one room, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a fireplace on the far wall, a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with no mattress, and shelves built into the walls. Hannah turned to find all 3 children awake now, sitting up by the dead fire, looking around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. In the daylight, its poverty was more obvious. The rough-hewn logs, the gaps between boards, the thick layer of dust on every surface, the complete absence of anything soft or comfortable. But it had walls, and walls meant everything. "Good morning, babies," Hannah said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "How did you sleep?" "I was warm," Abigail said wonderingly, as if warmth were a miracle she'd forgotten existed. "Mama, I was warm all night." "Me too," Thomas echoed, rubbing his eyes with small fists. Samuel said nothing, just looked at Hannah with those serious eyes that asked all the questions he was too careful to speak aloud. "Whose cabin is this? Are we allowed to stay? What happens now?" "I'm going to look around," Hannah said, addressing the worry in her son's face, even if she couldn't answer it. "See what's here. I got no family to leave this place to, no children to inherit. This cabin kept me alive for 20 years, gave me shelter when I had nothing else. Seems right. It should do the same for someone else who needs it. Take what you can use, fix what needs fixing, and if you stay, treat her with respect. Good walls are hard to find out here." Jed Miller, Spring, 1876. Hannah read the letter 3 times, her throat tightening with each pass. "Last spring," the stranger had said. Jed Miller died last spring. This letter had been waiting in that box for nearly a year, and in all that time no one had come to claim the cabin. No family, no heirs, just an empty structure and a dead man's invitation to whoever needed it most. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the box, her eyes burning with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not yet. Not when the children were watching. "Mama?" Abigail's small voice. "What is it?" "Nothing, sweetheart." But Thomas had started crying from hunger an hour ago, and Abigail's lips had gone pale, and Samuel was watching her with those eyes that tried so hard to be brave while his stomach ate itself from the inside. "Thank you," she said, the words scraping out of her throat like gravel. I don't know how to—" "Don't need to know." The man stepped back from the door, putting distance between them again. "Just need to feed your kids." He started to turn away, but Hannah's voice stopped him. "Wait, what's your name?" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, would just mount his horse and disappear again like he had last night. But then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Ethan Brooks." "I'm Hannah Cole. These are my children, Samuel, Abigail, and Thomas." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the introduction without elaborating on it. "If you need anything else, I work at the Dawson Ranch, 5 miles east of here. Anyone can tell you how to find it." "You work cattle?" "Whatever needs doing." He swung into his saddle with that same easy grace, gathering the reins in one weathered hand. Hannah watched him, this quiet man who'd appeared in a storm and given them shelter and now food, who offered help without explanation and expected nothing in return. "Mr. Brooks?" she called out before he could ride away. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on the saddle horn, his eyes on the horizon. When he spoke, his words were slow and measured, as if he was choosing them carefully from a limited supply. "Had a sister once," he said. "Younger, Sweet girl. Our parents died when she was 12. I was 17, thought I could take care of her myself, but I was working cattle, gone weeks at a time. Left her alone too much. She died that winter, pneumonia, because I wasn't there, because she was in a tent that couldn't keep out the cold. He looked at Hannah then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not pity, something deeper, something that recognized her struggle because it mirrored his own failure. Can't bring her back, Ethan said quietly. Can't fix what I didn't do. But I see a woman with 3 kids in a tent that's falling apart, and I know how that ends. So I do what makes sense, that's all. Before Hannah could respond, before she could find words adequate to the weight of what he'd just shared, Ethan turned his horse and rode away, heading east across the grass toward wherever the Dawson Ranch lay beyond the horizon. Hannah stood in the doorway, watching until he disappeared from sight, her mind reeling. She'd thought his help was random, right place, right time, a good man who happened to ride by. But it wasn't random at all. It was grief. It was guilt. It was a man trying to save strangers because he couldn't save the one person who'd mattered most. Mama? Samuel appeared beside her, looking up with questioning eyes. Who was that? Someone who knows what it's like to lose people, Hannah said softly. Then she picked up the canvas sack and carried it inside, feeling its weight. Not just the physical pounds of food, but the emotional burden of a man's regret transformed into action. They ate that afternoon. Beans boiled in water from the well, salt pork fried in its own fat over the fire, cornmeal mixed into a thick mush that actually tasted like food. The children devoured everything, their hunger making them reckless, eating too fast until Hannah had to slow them down before they made themselves sick. She watched them eat, these children who'd been starving, and felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something adjacent to hope, the possibility of hope, the idea that maybe they could survive this, that maybe they'd found a place to stop running, to stop barely existing, to actually live. Over the next several days, Hannah worked to turn the cabin into something livable. She used the last of her strength to haul water from the well, to cook simple meals over the fire, to keep the children occupied and safe, while her mind raced through calculations of survival that never quite added up. The supplies Ethan had brought would last a few weeks, maybe a month, if she rationed carefully. But then what? She had no income, no prospects, no skills that anyone would pay for out here in the middle of nowhere. She could sew, her mother had taught her that much, but who needed sewing done 5 miles from the nearest ranch? On the 4th morning, she heard hoofbeats again. Hannah tensed instinctively, moving to the door and peering out. Ethan Brooks, returning. But this time he wasn't alone. A second rider accompanied him, an older man, heavy-set, with white hair and a beard that covered half his face. They stopped near the cabin, and Ethan dismounted while the other man stayed in his saddle. Hannah stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, feeling suddenly conscious of her appearance, the dress that hadn't been properly washed in weeks, the hair she'd tried to braid but had no mirror to check, the bare feet because her shoes had finally fallen apart 2 days ago. "Mrs. Cole," Ethan said, his voice carrying that same quiet steadiness. "This is Jim Dawson, owns the ranch where I work." Jim Dawson looked down at her from his horse, his eyes shrewd and assessing, but not unkind. "Ethan tells me you're a widow, 3 kids, looking to make a living." Hannah straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "That's right. Can you sew, mend clothes, repair leather, that sort of thing?" "Yes, sir. My mother taught me. I'm good with a needle." Jim nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Ranch hands are hell on clothes. Tear 'em, wear 'em out, go through shirts and pants like water. My wife used to do the mending, but she passed last year. Been sending things into town, but that's 40 miles round trip. Waste of time and money." Hannah's heart started beating faster, hope rising despite her efforts to contain it. "You're offering me work?" "Offering you a trade. You mend what needs mending, I pay you in supplies, flour, beans, whatever you need. Fair rate. No charity." "I don't want charity," Hannah said quickly, firmly. "I want to earn my way." "Good." Jim's expression softened slightly, approval flickering across his weathered face. Because I don't give charity. I give fair work for fair pay. Ethan will bring you a load of mending tomorrow. You get it done in a week, we'll see how it goes from there." He didn't wait for her response, just turned his horse and rode off, leaving Ethan standing there in the morning sun. Hannah looked at this man who'd saved them, who'd brought them food, who'd now brought them work, a way to survive that didn't require begging or depending on kindness that might evaporate without warning. "You did this. You arranged this." Jim needed someone to do mending. You need work. Makes sense. It's more than that. Ethan shook his head slightly, his expression unchanging. It's exactly that. Nothing more. But Hannah knew better. This man who spoke in plain facts and simple logic, who helped without expecting gratitude, who kept his distance while making sure they had what they needed, he was lying. Not about the work being real or the trade being fair, but about his motivations. This wasn't just making sense. This was caring, disguised as practicality, because caring made him vulnerable, and practicality kept him safe. "Mr. Brooks?" "Ethan," he interrupted quietly. "Just Ethan." Ethan. Hannah tasted his name, found it fit him. Solid, unpretentious, exactly what it was. "Thank you for everything." He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, shifting his weight, his hand moving to his horse's reins like he wanted an excuse to leave. "You'd do the same, if you could." "I don't know if I would," Hannah said honestly. "I'd like to think so, but I don't know." Ethan studied her for a moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he mounted his horse and gathered the reins. "I'll bring the mending tomorrow, morning probably." He rode away without looking back, and Hannah stood watching him go, feeling the weight of obligation and gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name settling over her shoulders like a blanket. That night, she lay awake long after the children slept, staring at the cabin ceiling and thinking about Ethan Brooks. About the sister he'd lost, the guilt he carried, the way he helped without needing recognition or thanks. About how he'd given them not just shelter and food, but dignity, the chance to earn their way instead of simply surviving on mercy. She thought about his face in the rain, those storm-colored eyes that had assessed their situation without judgment, without pity, with nothing but quiet recognition of need and the simple decision to meet it. She thought about how he spoke, sparing words, each one chosen carefully, nothing wasted. She thought about the way he kept his distance, never presuming intimacy or familiarity, treating her with a respect she hadn't expected from anyone, let alone a stranger. And she wondered what it cost him, this kindness disguised as logic. What it cost to see them and remember his sister, to help them knowing he couldn't help her, to carry that grief transformed into action every time he rode away. The next morning, true to his word, Ethan arrived with a canvas sack full of torn shirts, ripped pants, leather vests with broken seams, and a jacket with buttons missing. He set it on the table without ceremony, then pulled out a smaller bundle, thread in various colors, needles, buttons, a leather punch, and strong twine for heavy repairs. "Jim said to tell you he'll need it back by next week," Ethan said. "But take your time. Do it right." Hannah picked up one of the shirts, examining the torn sleeve. The repair would be simple, straightforward, the kind of mending she'd done 1,000 times. But her hands had forgotten steadiness, had grown used to shaking with hunger and fear, and she had to concentrate to keep the fabric from trembling. "I can do this," she said, more to herself than to him. "I know." Ethan's voice was quiet but certain, as if he'd never doubted her capability. Wouldn't have brought it otherwise. He turned to leave, but Samuel appeared from the corner where he'd been watching, his small face serious. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan stopped, looking down at the boy. "Thank you for helping my mama," Samuel said, his voice steady despite his age. "She tries to pretend everything's okay, but I know it's not. And you made it better, so thank you." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a moment of warmth breaking through the carefully maintained distance. He crouched down to Samuel's level, putting them eye to eye. "Your mama's doing a good job," Ethan said quietly. "Takes strength to keep going when everything's falling apart. Takes courage to accept help when you'd rather do it yourself. You should be proud of her." "I am," Samuel said simply. Ethan nodded, then stood and walked out without another word, leaving Samuel standing there looking older than 7 years had any right to make a child look. Hannah watched her son, saw the way he stood straighter after Ethan's words, the way he carried himself with a dignity that hadn't been there before. And she realized that Ethan hadn't just helped them survive. He'd helped them remember their worth, had treated them not as objects of pity, but as people deserving of respect, capable of earning their way, worth the investment of his time and resources. She picked up the first shirt and began to sew, her needle moving through the fabric with a precision she'd thought she'd lost. With each stitch, she felt something returning to her, not just skill, but purpose. Not just survival, but the possibility of something beyond mere existence. Outside, the Wyoming sun climbed higher, warming the cabin walls. Inside, Hannah Cole sat at a table that wasn't hers, in a cabin that a dead man had left for whoever needed it, and began the work of rebuilding a life from thread and fabric and the quiet mercy of a stranger who refused to call his kindness what it was. The work came steadily after that first week. Hannah finished the initial batch of mending in 5 days, her fingers flying through repairs with a speed and precision that surprised even her. When Ethan returned to collect it, he examined each piece carefully, not suspiciously, but with the attention of someone who understood quality work when he saw it. He nodded once, approval in that single gesture, and rode away with the mended clothes bundled behind his saddle. 2 days later, he returned with payment. Not money, but supplies that were worth more than money. 2 sacks of flour, a bag of cornmeal, dried beans, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth, salt, sugar, and a tin of coffee that made Hannah's throat tighten with gratitude she refused to show. The coffee alone was a luxury she hadn't tasted in over a year. "Jim's pleased," Ethan said, setting the supplies on the table. "Says the mending's better than what he was getting in town. Wants to know if you'll take on more." "Yes," Hannah said immediately. "As much as he'll give me." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Don't wear yourself out. Kids need you healthy. Kids need to eat. They need both." His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned hard lessons about what happened when you sacrifice too much. "Take care of yourself, or you won't be able to take care of them." Before Hannah could respond, Thomas came running in from outside, his face lit with excitement. "Mama, Mama, look what I found." He held up a smooth stone, ordinary except for the joy it brought him. Ethan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch, then crouched down to Thomas's level. "Want to see something?" Thomas nodded eagerly, and Ethan opened the pouch, revealing a collection of arrowheads, different sizes, different colors, carefully preserved. "Found these over the years, different places. This one," he held up a black one, perfectly shaped, "came from near the creek about a mile north of here. Can I touch it?" Thomas's voice was hushed with reverence. "Carefully." Ethan placed it in Thomas's small palm, and the boy held it like treasure. Hannah watched this quiet exchange, this man who kept his distance from her but showed patience with her son, who spoke few words to adults but made time for a 3-year-old's wonder. Abigail and Samuel had crept closer, drawn by their brother's excitement, and Ethan showed them each arrowhead, telling them in his sparse way where he'd found it, what it might have been used for. "The people who made these," Samuel asked, "do they still live here?" "Some do. Different places. Some moved on, some stayed. Land remembers them either way." Ethan carefully repacked the arrowheads and stood, handing the pouch to Samuel. "Keep these. Maybe you'll find more to add to the collection." Samuel stared at the pouch in his hands, overwhelmed. "But they're yours. Were mine. Now they're yours." Ethan moved toward the door, clearly uncomfortable with the gratitude shining in the children's faces. "I'll bring more mending in a few days." He was gone before Hannah could thank him again, leaving behind supplies and arrowheads and another layer of kindness he'd refused to acknowledge as such. The weeks began to form a rhythm. Ethan would arrive every few days with mending, sometimes a small bundle, sometimes enough to keep Hannah busy from dawn until the children went to sleep. She worked by firelight when necessary, her needle moving through fabric while Samuel read aloud from the one book they owned, a battered copy of fairy tales that had somehow survived their journey west. Abigail would practice her letters in the dirt outside, and Thomas would play with his arrowheads, creating elaborate stories about the people who'd made them. Hannah's hands grew strong again, calloused in new places, her fingers remembering skills her mother had taught her before the world had fallen apart. And with each completed repair, each bundle of supplies Ethan brought in payment, she felt something shifting inside her. Not just survival, but the possibility of stability, of building something that might last beyond tomorrow. But stability attracted attention. It was mid-October when the first riders came. 3 men on horseback, dressed in town clothes rather than work gear, stopping at the cabin with expressions that mixed curiosity with suspicion. Hannah had been outside hanging laundry on a rope strung between the cabin and a post Ethan had helped Samuel set into the ground, and she saw them coming from a distance. She called the children inside and stepped out to meet them, her spine straight, her chin up, every inch of her body language saying she had nothing to hide and no reason to fear. The leader, a thin man with a sharp face and expensive boots, dismounted and approached. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Walter Pierce. I'm a land agent working for the Territorial Land Office." Hannah's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. "Hannah Cole, what can I do for you?" Pierce looked past her at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the evidence of habitation. "This is the old Miller place. Been vacant since Jed died last spring. We've been meaning to come out here and assess it, see if there's anyone with a legal claim." "There isn't," Hannah said flatly. "Jed left a letter saying anyone who needed it could use it. We needed it." "Letter doesn't constitute a legal claim, ma'am." Pierce's voice was polite but firm, the tone of a man who'd had this conversation before. "The cabin and the land it sits on revert to the territory in the absence of heirs, which means you're technically squatting on government property." Fear spiked through Hannah's chest, sharp and cold. "We're not hurting anything, just living here, keeping the place maintained." "That may be, but the law's the law." Pierce pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Now, if you wanted to file a claim, establish legal residency, that's a different matter, but it requires documentation, fees, proof of improvement to the property." "How much?" Hannah interrupted. Pierce named a figure that might as well have been $1 million. Hannah's last coin had been spent months ago. She had nothing but the food Ethan brought in trade for mending, and you couldn't pay government fees with beans and flour. "I don't have that kind of money," Hannah said, hearing the desperation creep into her voice despite her efforts to contain it. Pierce shrugged, not unkindly but not sympathetically either. "Then I'm afraid you'll need to vacate. We'll give you 2 weeks to find alternative arrangements." 2 weeks? Hannah felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "Where am I supposed to go with 3 children and no money?" "That's not really my concern, ma'am. I'm just here to enforce the law." Pierce tucked his notebook away. 2 weeks. After that, if you're still here, we'll have to take action." They rode away, leaving Hannah standing in front of the cabin that had become home, feeling everything she'd built over the past month crumbling like sand. The children appeared in the doorway, their faces anxious. "Mama?" Samuel's voice was small. "Do we have to leave?" Hannah wanted to lie, wanted to tell him everything would be fine, but she was so tired of lying. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." That afternoon, when Ethan arrived with another bundle of mending, Hannah told him what had happened. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to present it as just another problem to solve, but her hands shook as she spoke and her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Ethan listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the land stretching toward the horizon. "How much do they want?" he asked finally. Hannah told him. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of emotion crossing his carefully controlled features. "I don't have that much saved," he said slowly, "but I could probably get most of it. Take me a few weeks, maybe a month." "No." Hannah's voice was sharp, cutting through his offer before he could finish it. "Absolutely not. You've done enough. More than enough. I won't take your savings." "Hannah." "No." She stood her ground, meeting his eyes directly. "You've already given us shelter and food and work. You've already saved our lives. I won't let you give up everything you've worked for just to what?" Ethan's voice was quiet but intense, more emotion in it than she'd ever heard from him. "Just to keep you from being thrown out? Just to make sure those kids have a roof over their heads? That's not charity, Hannah. That's just making sense. It's your money, your future. What future? The words came out harsh, raw, and Ethan looked away, his jaw working. I work cattle, sleep in a bunkhouse, got no family, no plans beyond the next season. Money just sits there doing nothing. At least this way it would mean something. Hannah felt her throat close with emotion. Not gratitude, though that was part of it, but something deeper. Recognition of what his offer cost him, not in dollars, but in the admission that he had nothing and no one to save that money for. That helping them gave his life a purpose it otherwise lacked. I can't let you do that, she said softly. But thank you for offering. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting her refusal without argument, but his expression remained troubled. Then what are you going to do? I don't know. Hannah sank into one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. Find another abandoned cabin, I suppose. Start over somewhere else. Keep moving until something changes, or we run out of places to move to. The hopelessness in her own voice frightened her. She'd been so close to stability, to security, to building something real, and now it was slipping away because of laws and fees and documentation she couldn't provide. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, then moved to the door. I'll think on it. Maybe there's another way. He left without explaining what that meant, and Hannah sat at the table surrounded by mending she no longer had the heart to work on, wondering what happened when even survival stopped being enough. But Ethan did think on it, and 3 days later he returned with Jim Dawson and another man Hannah didn't recognize, older, distinguished-looking, wearing a suit that marked him as someone from town, someone with education and authority. Mrs. Cole, Jim said, dismounting and gesturing to the stranger, this is Henry Walsh. He's a lawyer from Cheyenne. Ethan asked him to look into your situation. Hannah stood slowly, hope and suspicion warring in her chest. I can't afford a lawyer. You're not paying me, Walsh said, his voice cultured but not condescending. Ethan is. Or rather, he's trading work for my services. I need a new barn built on my property, and Ethan's agreed to do it in exchange for legal representation. Hannah looked at Ethan, who stood slightly apart from the others, his expression as unreadable as ever. But she could see it now, the pattern of his caring disguised as practicality. The way he found solutions that let her keep her dignity while ensuring she got help. The way he took on burdens himself rather than making her feel like she owed him. I've reviewed the situation, Walsh continued, pulling papers from his leather case. And there is a legal provision that might apply here. The Homestead Act allows individuals to claim government land if they meet certain requirements. Typically, that requires establishing residency and making improvements over a 5-year period. However, there's a clause for widows with dependent children that reduces that time significantly if they can demonstrate continuous habitation and improvement. Hannah's heart started beating faster. What does that mean? It means, Walsh said, that if you can prove you've been living here and maintaining the property, you may be able to file a claim for the land and cabin without paying the full fees. You'd still need to meet certain requirements over the next year, but it's considerably less than what Pierce was demanding. But I haven't been here long enough. Jed Miller's letter helps your case. He explicitly invited anyone who needed shelter to use the property. That establishes an intention for ongoing habitation. Combined with the fact that you have 3 young children and no other means of support, and that you've been maintaining the property rather than letting it fall into disrepair. Walsh spread his hands. It's not a guaranteed win, but it's a strong case. Stronger than Pierce probably expected you to make. Hannah felt dizzy with the possibility of it. And if it works? If they approve the claim? Then the cabin and the surrounding 5 acres become legally yours. You'd have to continue living here and making improvements, but after 1 year, the deed would be recorded in your name, free and clear. The word yours echoed in Hannah's mind like a bell. Not borrowed, not temporary, not dependent on anyone's mercy or charity or willingness to let her stay. Hers. What do I need to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside her. Walsh smiled. First, we file the paperwork. I've already begun preparing it. Then you continue exactly what you've been doing. Living here, maintaining the property, establishing yourself as a productive member of the community. Can you read and write? Yes, my mother made sure of that. Good. You'll need to keep records of improvements you make, work you do, document everything, and it would help if you had character witnesses, people who can attest to your stability and contribution to the area. I'll vouch for her, Jim Dawson said immediately. She does good work, reliable, honest. I'd be willing to testify to that. As would I, Ethan added quietly. Hannah looked between them. These men who barely knew her, who were willing to stand up in front of officials and put their reputations behind her claim. The weight of it threatened to break something inside her, not from burden, but from the sheer unexpected grace of being seen, being valued, being supported by people who had no obligation to care. I don't know what to say, she managed. Say you'll fight for this, Walsh replied. Say you'll document everything and follow through on the requirements. Say you'll prove that you deserve this claim. Hannah straightened her shoulders, feeling something fierce and determined rising in her chest. I will. I'll prove it, whatever it takes. Walsh nodded approvingly. Good. I'll file the paperwork this week. In the meantime, if Pierce or anyone else comes around threatening eviction, you send them to me. You have legal representation now, and you have the right to fight for this claim. After Walsh and Jim left, Ethan lingered, checking the woodpile, adjusting the rope that held the laundry line, doing small tasks that didn't need doing. Hannah watched him, understanding now that this was how he showed care, through action, through solving problems, through giving help in ways that looked like anything but charity. You didn't have to build him a barn, she said finally. Ethan shrugged, not meeting her eyes. Needed building anyway. Walsh's old one's falling apart. And it's fair trade, work for work. It's more than that. It's exactly that. But there was something in his voice, a slight crack in the careful neutrality he maintained, that told her he was lying. That it was more. That it had always been more. That every act of help he'd given them was weighted with the grief of a sister he couldn't save, and the determination to save someone else's children instead. Ethan. Hannah waited until he looked at her, until those storm-colored eyes met hers. Why do you keep your distance? You help us. You look after us. You make sure we have everything we need, but you never stay, never sit down for a meal, never linger longer than necessary. Why? Ethan was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. Because staying is dangerous. Dangerous how? Because if I stay, I might start to think... He stopped, shook his head. It's better this way. I help when needed, keep things practical. That way nobody gets hurt when things change. What if things don't change? Hannah asked softly. What if we stay? Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, longing mixed with fear, hope tangled with old pain. Then I guess we'd have to figure out what staying means. He left before she could respond, mounting his horse and riding away like he always did, leaving Hannah standing in front of the cabin with more questions than answers, and a heart that had started beating in rhythms she didn't quite recognize. Over the following weeks, Hannah threw herself into documenting everything Walsh had told her to record. She kept a journal of repairs made to the cabin, improvements to the property, work completed for Jim Dawson. She noted every bundle of mending, every payment received, every day they lived in the cabin and made it more of a home. Ethan came and went with quiet regularity, bringing mending and supplies, checking on things that needed checking, slowly building trust through consistency rather than words. He taught Samuel how to set snares for rabbits, showed Abigail which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid, let Thomas help carry wood until the little boy glowed with pride at being useful. And slowly, carefully, he started staying a little longer each visit. Not much, just 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Long enough to accept a cup of coffee. Long enough to answer one of the children's endless questions. Long enough to meet Hannah's eyes across the cabin and not immediately look away. But the threat of Pierce returning hung over everything, a shadow that wouldn't lift until Walsh's legal claim was processed and approved. Hannah worked harder than ever, driven by the fear that one mistake, one oversight, one failure to document properly would cost them everything. Then, on a cold November morning, Pierce came back. Hannah saw him approaching with 2 other men, and her stomach turned to ice. She stepped outside to meet them, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, every muscle in her body tight with the need to defend what had become theirs. "Mrs. Cole," Pierce said, dismounting, "I'm here to follow up on the matter of your occupancy." "I have legal representation," Hannah said immediately, her voice steady despite her fear. "Henry Walsh out of Cheyenne. He's filed a homestead claim on my behalf. You need to take any questions through him." Pierce's expression flickered with surprise, then annoyance. "A homestead claim? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I'm a widow with 3 dependent children, that I've been maintaining this property and improving it, and that I have every legal right to file for it under the Homestead Act provisions for widows." Hannah spoke carefully, repeating the words Walsh had coached her to say. "If you have objections to that claim, you can file them with Mr. Walsh or with the Territorial Land Office directly. But until they rule on it, I'm not going anywhere." Pierce studied her, clearly reassessing. She held his gaze, refusing to back down, refusing to show the terror churning in her gut. Behind her, she heard the cabin door open, felt the presence of her children watching, depending on her to be strong enough to fight for them. "Fine," Pierce said finally. "We'll review the claim. But, Mrs. Cole, you should know, these things don't always go the way people hope. Don't get too comfortable here." "I'll take my chances." Pierce remounted, clearly frustrated but unable to force the issue now that she had legal standing. "You'll hear from the land office within 60 days. Until then, consider yourself on notice." They rode away, and Hannah stood watching them go, her legs shaking so badly she had to grab the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Samuel was beside her instantly, his small hand gripping hers. "Did we win, Mama?" he asked. "Not yet," Hannah said, her voice unsteady. "But we're still fighting, and that counts for something." That evening, Ethan arrived with supplies and found Hannah sitting outside the cabin, staring at the sunset, her face drawn with exhaustion and stress. He sat down beside her without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and said nothing for a long time. "Pierce came back," Hannah said finally. "I heard. Jim sent word." Ethan's voice was quiet. "Walsh says the claim's strong, says you've got a good chance. But not guaranteed." "Nothing's guaranteed." Ethan looked out at the darkening sky. "But you're fighting. That's more than most people do." Hannah turned to look at him. This man who'd shown up in a storm and changed everything, who kept giving without asking for anything in return, who protected without controlling and helped without expecting gratitude. "Why do you care so much? And don't tell me it's just about making sense. I know it's more than that." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, he spoke. "When my sister died, I made a promise that I wouldn't stand by and watch people suffer if I could do something about it, that I wouldn't let anyone be alone the way she was alone. It's not about you specifically. It's about," he struggled for words, "it's about making different choices than the ones I made before, about not failing again." "You didn't fail her," Hannah said softly. "You were 17. You did the best you could. My best wasn't good enough. And mine might not be either, but we're both still trying." Hannah reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the steadiness. That has to count for something. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, his expression unguarded for once, vulnerable in the fading light. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. "Whatever happens with the claim, whatever Pierce tries, you're not alone. I'll make sure of that." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise of anything beyond continued support. But sitting there in the November cold, holding the hand of a man who'd saved them without asking for anything in return, Hannah felt something shift inside her. Not hope, exactly, but something stronger. The certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. That she'd found not just shelter in a storm, but an anchor in a man who understood what it meant to fail and choose to try again anyway. The sun set completely, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside the cabin, the children were settling down for the night. And outside, Hannah and Ethan sat in silence, their hands still joined, facing whatever would come with the quiet strength of two people who'd learned that survival was only the beginning, and that sometimes the greatest courage was allowing yourself to believe in something beyond just making it through another day. Winter came to Wyoming with teeth. The first serious snow fell in late November, transforming the plains overnight from brown and gold to white and gray, erasing landmarks and making the 2-mile distance to the nearest ranch feel like 20. Hannah woke to find frost coating the inside of the cabin windows, ice in the water bucket, and her breath visible in the air despite the fire she'd banked the night before. She rebuilt the fire quickly, her fingers numb with cold, then wrapped the children in every blanket they owned and fed them hot cornmeal mush that steamed in their bowls. Outside, the world had become a stranger, silent, vast, and unforgiving in ways the summer plains had never been. When Ethan arrived that afternoon, riding through snow that came up to his horse's knees, Hannah felt relief so intense it bordered on pain. He'd come, despite the storm, despite the cold, despite every reason to stay safe in the bunkhouse at Dawson's ranch. He'd come to make sure they were all right. He brought firewood strapped to his saddle, more than she could have carried herself, cut and split and dried, and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that turned out to be thick wool blankets, the kind that cost money she didn't have. "From Jim's wife," Ethan said when Hannah started to protest. "She passed last year, like I told you. He was going to donate these to the church, but figured you needed them more." It was a lie. Hannah could see it in the way Ethan wouldn't quite meet her eyes, the way his jaw was set just slightly too firm. These blankets were new, or near enough. Jim Dawson's wife hadn't owned them. Ethan had bought them himself, then constructed a story that would let Hannah accept them without feeling like charity. "Thank Jim for me," Hannah said softly, accepting the lie because refusing would hurt him more than her pride was worth protecting. Ethan nodded and began stacking the firewood beside the cabin, his movements efficient and practiced. Samuel came out to help, his small arms carrying pieces that were almost too big for him, determination written across his young face. Ethan didn't send him back inside, didn't tell him he was too small or getting in the way. He just worked alongside the boy, occasionally adjusting Samuel's grip on a log or showing him how to stack wood so it would stay dry. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better," Ethan said as they finished. "You got enough food to last a week if I can't get back?" Hannah mentally calculated their supplies. "Yes, we'll be all right. Coffee's running low." It wasn't a question. Somehow Ethan always knew what they needed before she had to ask. "We can manage without it." "Shouldn't have to." Ethan went back to his horse and returned with another wrapped bundle, coffee, and also sugar and dried apples that made Abigail gasp with delight when she saw them. "Ethan, this is too much." "It's payment for mending," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Jim's got another batch for you. Soon as the weather breaks, I'll bring it." But there was no mending bundled with the supplies, and Hannah knew there wouldn't be. This was Ethan making sure they survived the winter, disguised as work arrangements and dead women's charity, because direct help would make her feel indebted, and he understood that debt could be as crushing as hunger. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on maintaining the fiction of equal exchange, but the truth was stark and simple. They needed these things, and refusing them would be choosing pride over her children's survival. And she'd learned that lesson too many times to make that mistake again. "Stay for coffee," she said instead, an invitation that felt bigger than the words implied. Ethan hesitated, his hand on his horse's reins, clearly torn between accepting and maintaining the distance he'd carefully constructed. "Storm's getting worse." "Then you definitely shouldn't ride back in it. Stay until it passes. We have room." Hannah gestured to the cabin. "It's not much, but it's warm." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, uncertainty mixed with longing, the want to stay battling against the fear of what staying might mean. Hannah held her breath, waiting, realizing that his answer mattered more than it should, that somewhere in the past months she'd started needing his presence for reasons beyond survival. "All right," Ethan said finally, "until the storm passes." He led his horse to the small lean-to shed beside the cabin, another improvement he'd helped Samuel build, and settled the animal with hay and a blanket. Then he came inside, ducking through the doorway, and suddenly the cabin felt smaller, more intimate, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Hannah poured coffee into tin cups while Ethan sat at the table, looking uncomfortable in the domestic space, his large frame making the rough furniture seem fragile. The children gravitated toward him naturally, Thomas climbing into his lap without invitation, Abigail showing him the letters she'd been practicing, Samuel asking questions about tracking animals in snow. Ethan answered patiently, his voice low and measured, giving each child the attention they craved. And Hannah watched him, this man who claimed he kept his distance, who insisted he was just being practical, while a 3-year-old boy dozed against his chest, and he explained to a 7-year-old how to read deer tracks in fresh powder. The storm intensified as evening fell, wind howling around the cabin, snow driving against the walls with a sound like sand on wood. Hannah cooked beans and salt pork, stretching the portions to feed 4 instead of 3, and they ate together at the small table, squeezed close, sharing warmth and food and the strange comfort of not being alone. After dinner, Samuel read aloud from their fairy tale book while the storm raged outside. Abigail and Thomas listened with rapt attention, and Ethan sat very still, his eyes on the fire, his expression distant. Hannah wondered what he was thinking, if he was remembering his sister, if domestic scenes like this one hurt him, or healed him, or both at once. When the children finally fell asleep, nestled together under the new wool blankets, Hannah and Ethan sat by the fire in silence. The wind made the cabin creak and groan, but the walls held firm, the roof stayed solid, and the fire kept burning. "You've made this place into a real home," Ethan said quietly, breaking the long silence. "Jed would be pleased." "Did you know him? Jed Miller?" "Some. He kept to himself mostly, but he was decent, fair, the kind of man who'd leave a letter in a box telling strangers they could have his cabin." Ethan stared into the flames. "World could use more people like that." "Like you," Hannah said softly. Ethan shook his head. "I'm not decent. I'm just trying to make up for what I didn't do." "That's not true. You don't help us because of guilt. You help us because you're good. Because you see people who need help, and you can't walk past without doing something about it. You don't know what I am. I know you rode through a blizzard to bring firewood to a woman you barely know. I know you bought blankets and lied about where they came from. I know you built a barn you didn't need to build so I could have a lawyer I couldn't afford. I know—" Her voice caught, emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "I know you saved my children's lives and won't even let me thank you properly." Ethan looked at her then, his storm-colored eyes reflecting firelight, and she saw something raw in them, something vulnerable he usually kept buried beneath layers of careful neutrality. "You don't owe me anything, Hannah. That's not why I do this." "I know. That's what makes it matter." They sat in silence after that, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. Hannah wanted to reach for him, wanted to close the distance he maintained so carefully, but she held back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood that Ethan needed to come to her in his own time, in his own way. That rushing him would only drive him further behind the walls he'd built to protect himself from caring too much. The storm lasted 3 days. Ethan slept by the fire those nights, giving the children the bed, insisting he was more comfortable on the floor despite Hannah's protests. During the days, he helped with chores, hauling water from the well, which he had to dig out of snowdrifts twice a day, splitting more firewood, repairing a section of wall where the chinking had come loose and let in drafts. He worked steadily, quietly, speaking little but present in a way that changed the entire atmosphere of the cabin. The children bloomed under his attention. Samuel followed him everywhere, learning by watching, absorbing skills and knowledge with the intensity of a boy hungry for a father figure. Abigail brought him her letters to check, glowing when he praised her careful formation of words. Thomas simply stayed close, content to be near someone who represented safety and strength. And Hannah watched it all, her heart aching with recognition of what they'd been missing, what these children deserved and hadn't had since John died. A man who showed up, who stayed, who cared without expectation or demand. On the 3rd night, after the children were asleep and the wind had finally died to a whisper, Ethan sat by the fire cleaning his knife, the rhythmic sound of wet stone on metal filling the quiet. Hannah mended by lamplight, her needle moving through fabric with practiced ease, comfortable with the silence in a way she'd never been before. "The land claim," Ethan said suddenly, not looking up from his work. "You worried about it?" "Every day," Hannah admitted. "Walsh says it's strong, but Pierce seemed determined to find a reason to deny it." Pierce is a bastard. The profanity sounded strange in Ethan's careful speech, a crack in his usual restraint. He's been trying to grab up empty properties for months, claiming them for himself or selling them to people willing to pay under the table. He doesn't like it when someone files a legitimate claim before he can work his schemes. Will he fight it? Probably. But Walsh is better at law than Pierce is at scheming. And you've got support. Jim, me, half a dozen ranch hands who think Pierce is crooked. You're not alone in this fight. Hannah set down her mending, her hands suddenly still. Why do you keep saying that? That I'm not alone? Ethan finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the firelight. Because you spent too long thinking you were. And I need you to know you're not. Not anymore. Is that because of your sister? Because you couldn't save her, so you're trying to save us? Started that way, Ethan said slowly, honestly. But it's not just that anymore. He stopped, struggling with words, his usual economy of speech failing him. You're strong, Hannah. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. You fight for your kids. You don't give up. You don't ask for help even when you're drowning. And watching you, being around you, it makes me want to be better than I am. Makes me want to stop just surviving and actually build something that matters. Hannah's breath caught. Ethan, I know I should keep my distance, he continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. I know that's safer, cleaner, but I can't anymore. These past 3 days, being here with you and the kids, it's the first time in 10 years I felt like I'm part of something instead of just passing through. And I know I've got no right to want that, no right to want more than you've already given me, but stop. Hannah stood and crossed to him, kneeling by his chair so they were eye level. Stop saying you have no right. Stop acting like you're asking for something you don't deserve. You've earned the right to be here 100 times over. You've earned the right to stay, to be part of this, She took a breath, steadying herself. To be part of this family, if that's what you want. Ethan stared at her, his carefully controlled expression cracking completely, showing the longing and fear and desperate hope beneath. What if I can't? What if I fail you the way I failed her? Then we fail together, but I don't think you will. I think you're the most reliable, steady, good man I've ever known, and I think my children need you, and... Her voice dropped to a whisper. And I think I need you too. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his rough, calloused hand. If I stay all the way. Not just helping from a distance, not just checking in. I stay and I'm part of this, whatever this becomes. Can you live with that? I've been hoping for it since you first walked into that storm, Hannah said honestly. Ethan leaned forward and kissed her, gentle, careful, like he was afraid she might break or disappear. Hannah kissed him back, tasting coffee and smoke and something that felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. When they pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I'm not good with words, he said quietly. Never have been, but I'll show you. Every day. I'll show you what I can't say. I know you will. You always have. They sat together by the fire until it burned down to embers, not talking, just being close in a way that felt both new and inevitable. And when Hannah finally rose to check on the children, Ethan came with her, standing beside her in the darkness, watching 3 small bodies sleep peacefully under wool blankets he'd bought with money he'd earned through hard labor. They're good kids, he said softly. You've done well by them. We've done well by them, Hannah corrected. You've been here for months now. You're as much a part of raising them as I am. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, even quieter, he said, I'd like to make that permanent. If you're willing. Hannah turned to look at him, understanding what he was asking without him having to spell it out. Are you proposing? Not properly, not yet, but... Ethan struggled again with words. When the land claim goes through, when you've got the deed in your hand and nobody can take this away from you, I'd like to ask you then. I'd like to do it right, when you don't have to wonder if I'm offering out of pity or obligation. When you can say yes knowing it's because you want to, not because you need to. I would say yes right now, Hannah said honestly. Need has nothing to do with it anymore. But I want you to be sure. I want you to choose me when you don't have to, when you've got security and options and a future that's solid. Then if you still want me, his voice roughened, then I'll be the luckiest man alive. Hannah reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. I'll be sure. But I'm already sure, Ethan. I've been sure since you rode through a storm to save us and wouldn't even stay long enough to be thanked. They stood there in the dark cabin, holding hands, while 3 children slept and the Wyoming winter raged outside and inside. Finally, there was warmth and safety, and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The next morning, the storm broke. Sunlight poured through the window, painfully bright on endless white snow, and Ethan prepared to ride back to Dawson's ranch. The children protested his leaving, clinging to him with open affection, and he hugged each of them with a tenderness that made Hannah's throat tight. I'll be back in a few days, he promised Samuel, and we'll work on those snares you've been asking about. You promise? Samuel's voice was small, uncertain in the way of children who'd learned that promises often broke. I promise. I always come back. Ethan glanced at Hannah over Samuel's head, and she saw the truth in his eyes. He would come back. Not just for the children, not just because he'd promised, but because this cabin, this family, had become his home in ways that had nothing to do with walls or roofs or legal claims. After he left, the cabin felt emptier than it had before the storm, but not in a lonely way, in an anticipatory way, in a way that said something important had shifted and would keep shifting until it found its right shape. Hannah went back to her mending with renewed energy, documenting everything carefully in the journal Walsh had told her to keep. She noted the storm, the firewood Ethan had brought, the repairs made to the cabin, the continued work for Dawson's ranch. Every detail mattered, every piece of evidence that she was building a life here, making this place hers through labor and commitment and the determination to create something stable for her children. A week later, Walsh arrived with news. Hannah's heart hammered as she invited him in, offering coffee, trying to read his expression for signs of good or bad news. Walsh sat at her table, accepted the coffee gratefully, and pulled papers from his case. The land office has reviewed your claim, he said without preamble, and Pierce filed objections as we expected. He's arguing that you lack the financial resources to meet the improvement requirements, that you're dependent on charity, and that the property would be better served by someone with capital to develop it properly. Hannah's stomach dropped. So they're denying it? No. Walsh's expression shifted to something like satisfaction. Because I've filed counter-arguments addressing every point Pierce raised. I've documented the mending work you do for Dawson's ranch, showing consistent income. I've provided statements from Jim Dawson attesting to your reliability and contribution to the community. And I've noted the improvements you've already made to the property, repairs to the cabin, maintenance of the well, establishment of a productive household. Is that enough? It should be. But there's one more thing. Walsh looked at her seriously. The hearing is scheduled for January 15th in Cheyenne. You'll need to appear in person, answer questions from the territorial board, and demonstrate that you're capable of meeting the ongoing requirements. Can you do that? Cheyenne. 40 miles away through winter conditions, with 3 children and no transportation. Hannah's mind raced through possibilities, obstacles, solutions. Yes, she said firmly. I can do that. Walsh nodded approvingly. Good, because this is your chance to make your case directly. Pierce will be there arguing against you, and the board members can be swayed by whoever presents the stronger argument. You'll need to be confident, articulate, and unshakable in your commitment to this claim. Can you be those things? Hannah thought about everything she'd survived. Her husband's death, poverty, near starvation, the tent collapsing in the storm, the constant fight to keep her children alive through each impossible day. She thought about the strength it had taken to accept help, to trust a stranger, to choose survival over pride again and again. Yes, she said, meeting Walsh's eyes steadily. I can be those things. Because this isn't just about a piece of land. It's about giving my children a home. A real home. And I'll fight as hard as I need to for that. Walsh smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his professional demeanor. Then I believe you're going to win this, Mrs. Cole. I genuinely do. After Walsh left, Hannah stood outside the cabin in the cold January air, looking at the land that spread in every direction. This place that had seemed like temporary shelter had become something more. Not just a roof over their heads, but a foundation for a future. A place where her children could grow up safe and secure, where they could build lives that weren't defined by loss and struggle. And if she could just hold on a little longer, just fight one more battle, it would be theirs. Free and clear. A legacy built from nothing but determination and the unexpected mercy of a man who'd ridden through a storm and decided to stay. January 15th arrived with brutal clarity. A morning so cold the air itself seemed to crack with each breath, and so bright the snow glared like broken glass across the plains. Hannah woke before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves, and found Ethan already at the cabin door with a wagon borrowed from Jim Dawson. "Thought you might need a ride to Cheyenne," he said simply, as if offering to transport her family 40 miles through winter weather to fight for their home was nothing more than common courtesy. Hannah's throat tightened with gratitude she couldn't quite voice. "You don't have to." "I know." Ethan's eyes met hers, steady and certain. "I'm doing it anyway." They loaded the children into the wagon, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and set out as the sun broke over the horizon. The journey was long and cold, the wagon wheels crunching through packed snow, the horses' breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. Samuel sat up front with Ethan, asking questions about the land they passed, while Abigail and Thomas huddled with Hannah in the back, their small bodies pressed against her for warmth. Hannah watched the miles pass, her mind rehearsing arguments she'd practiced for weeks. She had to convince the territorial board that she deserved this claim, not because she needed it, though she did, but because she'd earned it through labor and commitment and the determination to build something lasting. She had to show them she was more than a desperate widow looking for handouts. She was a woman capable of creating a productive homestead, of contributing to the community, of raising children who would become solid citizens. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You're going to do fine," Ethan said quietly, as if he could read her thoughts. "You just have to tell them the truth. That's all they need to hear." "What if the truth isn't enough?" "Then it's not the truth they're listening for. But I don't think that's the case. Walsh says the board members are fair. They want to see genuine homesteaders, people who work the land and build communities. That's exactly what you are." Hannah wanted to believe him, but fear had its claws deep in her gut, whispering that she'd come this far only to fail, that the cabin would be taken away, that they'd end up right back where they started, homeless, helpless, at the mercy of elements and circumstance they couldn't control. They reached Cheyenne by mid-morning, the territorial capital bustling with activity despite the cold. Buildings rose on either side of wide dirt streets, some rough-hewn frontier structures, others more refined with glass windows, and painted signs declaring businesses and services. People moved with purpose, bundled against the weather, and Hannah felt suddenly small and exposed, a woman from nowhere with nothing, stepping into a world of law and property and legitimacy she'd never been part of. Walsh was waiting at the territorial building, an imposing stone structure that looked like it belonged in a different, more civilized world. He greeted them warmly, shaking Ethan's hand and crouching down to speak gently to the children. "Mrs. Cole, you ready?" Walsh asked, his tone both professional and kind. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good. Remember what we discussed. Be honest, be clear, and don't let Pierce rattle you. He'll try to make you seem desperate or dependent, but you counter that with facts. The work you do, the improvements you've made, the community support you have. You're not asking for charity. You're claiming what you've earned." Hannah nodded, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Ethan touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of support, then took the children aside to wait while Hannah and Walsh entered the building. The hearing room was smaller than Hannah had expected. A plain space with wooden benches, a raised platform where 3 board members sat behind a long table, and a witness chair facing them. Pierce was already there, standing near the front with papers spread before him, his expression confident and vaguely contemptuous. Hannah took her seat, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The board members, 2 men and 1 woman, all middle-aged and stern-looking, regarded her with neutral expressions that gave nothing away. The chairman, a graying man with spectacles, spoke first. "Mrs. Hannah Cole, you filed a homestead claim under the widow's provision for the property formerly belonging to Jedediah Miller. Mr. Pierce has filed objections to this claim. We're here to determine the validity of both arguments and make a ruling. Do you understand the proceedings? Yes, sir, Hannah said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Mr. Pierce, please present your objections. Pierce stood, his movements theatrical, designed to command attention. Gentlemen, Mrs. Whitmore, he nodded to the female board member, I'm not here to deny Mrs. Cole's unfortunate circumstances. Widowed, 3 young children, clearly struggling, these facts are not in dispute. However, the question before us is not whether Mrs. Cole deserves sympathy, but whether she meets the legal and practical requirements for a homestead claim. He paused for effect, then continued. The Homestead Act requires claimants to demonstrate the ability to improve and maintain the property. Mrs. Cole has no capital, no equipment, no livestock, and no independent means of support. She survives entirely on charity, food and supplies provided by local ranchers out of pity. She's done minimal mending work, yes, but that hardly constitutes a sustainable income. Furthermore, the property in question sits on land that could be developed by someone with actual resources, someone who could build a productive ranch, employ workers, contribute significantly to the territory's economy. Giving this claim to someone who can barely feed her own children is a waste of valuable resources. Hannah's face burned with anger and humiliation, but Walsh's hand on her arm kept her silent. Pierce sat down, looking satisfied, and the chairman turned to Hannah. Mrs. Cole, how do you respond to these objections? Hannah stood, her legs shaking, but her voice clear. Mr. Pierce is correct that I'm widowed and struggling. He's correct that I have 3 children and limited resources, but he's wrong about everything else. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts. I don't survive on charity. I survive on work. For the past 4 months, I've done mending for Dawson Ranch, repairing clothes, fixing leather, doing skilled labor that saves them the expense and time of traveling 40 miles to town. Jim Dawson pays me fairly in supplies, which is a trade agreement, not charity. That's how frontier economies work. Money isn't the only form of payment that matters. As for improvements to the property, I've repaired the cabin's walls, maintained the well, established a productive household, and documented all of it as required. I've proven I can survive harsh conditions, manage resources carefully, and maintain a stable home for my children. And regarding Mr. Pierce's claim that someone with more capital could do more with the land, Hannah's voice grew stronger, more confident. The Homestead Act exists precisely to give people like me a chance to build something from nothing. If only wealthy people could claim land, then we're not settling the West, we're just transferring power from one group of elites to another. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her expression interested. Mrs. Cole, what are your plans if this claim is approved? How do you intend to continue improving the property? I plan to expand the cabin to accommodate my growing children. I plan to establish a larger garden come spring, possibly acquire chickens if I can save enough from my mending work. I plan to continue providing services to local ranchers. There's demand for skilled sewing and repair work, and I'm good at it. Most importantly, I plan to raise my children to be productive members of this community, to teach them the value of hard work and self-sufficiency, and to contribute to the territory's growth in ways that matter beyond just profit. The second board member, who hadn't spoken yet, looked down at the papers before him. I see here that you have letters of support from Jim Dawson and several of his ranch hands. That's unusual. Most homestead claims don't generate that kind of community backing. That's because most people haven't met Mrs. Cole, Walsh interjected smoothly. She's earned that support through consistent reliability and contribution to the community. She's not someone looking for a handout. She's someone who's already proven herself valuable. Pierce stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. The woman is destitute. The woman is resourceful, Mrs. Whitmore said sharply, cutting Pierce off. There's a difference, Mr. Pierce, and if you can't see it, perhaps you're in the wrong line of work. Pierce's face flushed red, but he sat down without responding. The chairman looked at Hannah thoughtfully. Mrs. Cole, I have one final question. This property is isolated, difficult to access in winter, far from town and services. Why do you want it? There are other options. You could move to town, find work there, perhaps remarry someone with established means. Why fight so hard for a piece of land in the middle of nowhere? Hannah met his eyes directly, speaking from the deepest truth she knew. Because it's ours. Because my children sleep safely there. Because when the storm came and our tent collapsed, a stranger showed us mercy by leading us to that cabin, and we turned it into a home. Because I want my children to grow up knowing that you can lose everything and still rebuild, that you can start with nothing and still create something that matters. Because that land represents the possibility that we're not just surviving anymore. We're living. And that's worth fighting for. The room fell silent. Mrs. Whitmore's expression had softened considerably, and even the stern chairman looked moved. Pierce stared at his papers, his jaw tight with frustration. "Very well," the chairman said. "We'll deliberate and deliver our ruling. Please wait outside." Hannah walked out on trembling legs, Walsh beside her, and found Ethan standing with the children near the window. Samuel looked up anxiously as she approached. "What happened, Mama?" "I told them the truth," Hannah said, sinking onto a bench. "Now we wait." Ethan sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, solid and steady. "You did good in there. I could hear some of it through the door. You didn't back down." "I couldn't. Too much depends on this." They waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Thomas fell asleep against Hannah's side. Abigail traced patterns on the frosted window. Samuel sat rigid with tension, watching the door to the hearing room like it held all their futures behind it. Finally, Walsh emerged, and his face was unreadable. Hannah's heart plummeted. They'd denied it. They'd decided she wasn't good enough, wasn't capable enough, wasn't... "Congratulations, Mrs. Cole," Walsh said, breaking into a smile. "The claim has been approved. The cabin and 5 acres are legally yours. You'll need to meet certain improvement requirements over the next year, but as long as you continue doing what you've been doing, there should be no problems. The deed will be recorded in your name within the week." Hannah stood, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. "We won? We actually won." "You won." Pierce objected to the very end, but Mrs. Whitmore shut him down quite effectively. The board ruled unanimously in your favor. Walsh shook her hand formally. "You're a landowner now, Mrs. Cole. You've earned it." The words didn't feel real. Hannah looked at her children, at Samuel's face lighting up with understanding, at Abigail's confused happiness, at Thomas still sleeping peacefully, and felt something break open inside her chest. Not breaking like shattering, breaking like blooming. "We have a home," she whispered. "A real home. Forever." Ethan's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Told you. You just had to tell the truth." The journey back to the cabin was long but felt entirely different from the morning's trip. The children chattered excitedly about what they'd do with their land, with their home. Samuel wanted to build a barn. Abigail wanted a garden full of flowers. Thomas wanted chickens, though he called them chicken birds, in a way that made everyone laugh. Hannah sat in the back of the wagon, watching the planes roll past, feeling the weight of fear and uncertainty finally lifting from her shoulders. They had land, they had a home, they had security, and they had Ethan, this quiet man who'd appeared in a storm and stayed through every battle since. As the cabin came into view across the white expanse, Hannah felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness or fear, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude and the simple, profound joy of arriving home when home actually meant something permanent. Ethan helped unload the wagon, getting the children settled inside while Hannah stood outside for a moment, just looking at the cabin. Hers. The land beneath her feet, the walls around her children, the future they'd build here. All of it, legally and permanently, hers. "Hannah." Ethan's voice, quiet behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, backlit by firelight from inside, his expression serious but hopeful. He stepped out into the cold, closing the door behind him to give them privacy. "I said I'd wait until you had the deed," he began, his usual economy of words deserting him, making his speech awkward and endearing. "Until you had security and didn't need anything from anyone. Until you could choose freely without obligation or necessity clouding your judgment." "Ethan, let me finish. Please." He took a breath, his hands flexing at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. "You have the land now. You have a future that's solid, that can't be taken away. You don't need me for survival anymore. You don't need me for anything practical. So if you still want me, if you want me just because you want me, not because I'm useful or helpful or convenient, then I'd like to ask you properly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple, silver, clearly not expensive, but carefully chosen. "This was my mother's. Only thing I kept when my parents died. Been carrying it around for 10 years, never thinking I'd have someone to give it to. But Hannah," his voice roughened with emotion, "you're the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. You fight for what matters. You love fiercely. You build something real out of nothing but determination. And I want to spend the rest of my life helping you do that. Not because I feel guilty about my sister, not because you need saving, but because being with you makes me feel like I'm finally living instead of just existing. Will you marry me?" Hannah looked at this man who'd saved them without asking for anything, who'd kept his distance until she could choose him freely, who understood that true partnership meant respecting someone enough to let them stand on their own before asking them to stand together. Her heart felt too full for her chest, too big for her body, expanding with a love she'd thought she'd lost the capacity to feel. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because you saved us, though you did. Not because you're useful, though you are. But because I love you. Because you're the kind of man who rides through storms to help strangers and calls it making sense. Because my children need you and I need you, and you've become part of us in ways that go deeper than obligation or gratitude. So yes, Ethan Brooks, I'll marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. And then he pulled her close and kissed her with a desperation and tenderness that spoke everything his limited words couldn't express. Hannah kissed him back, tasting snow and coffee and the future they'd build together, and felt like she was finally, truly home. They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Dawson's Ranch, with Jim serving as witness, and the children standing beside them dressed in clothes Hannah had carefully mended and cleaned. Samuel held the ring during the brief exchange of vows. Abigail scattered dried flowers she'd saved from summer. Thomas mostly played with his arrowheads, but occasionally looked up and smiled at Ethan with complete trust. Walsh came to deliver the deed in person, presenting it to Hannah with formal ceremony. "Mrs. Brooks now, I suppose," he said warmly, "though the land remains in your name, as is proper." Hannah held the deed carefully, this piece of paper that represented everything they'd fought for: security, stability, a future built on solid ground. She showed it to the children, letting them touch it, letting them understand that this document meant they'd never be homeless again, never be at the mercy of storms or circumstance or men like Pierce, who measured worth in capital rather than courage. Spring came gradually to Wyoming, melting the snow, revealing grass and earth and the possibility of growth. Ethan moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse to the cabin, expanding it over several weeks to create more space for the growing family. He built a lean-to barn for the 2 horses Jim gave them as a wedding gift, and fenced a section of land for the garden Hannah planned. Samuel helped with everything, learning carpentry and animal care, with the intensity of a boy who'd found a father in everything but blood. Ethan taught him patiently, never rushing, always explaining the why behind each task. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, building not just structures but the kind of bond that forms between men when they create something together. Abigail discovered she had a talent for growing things, her small hands gentle with seedlings, her attention meticulous with watering and weeding. The garden flourished under her care, producing vegetables that made their meals richer and more varied. She took pride in feeding her family, in contributing something tangible to their survival and prosperity. Thomas remained the heart of them all, affectionate, curious, full of joy that hadn't been crushed by the hard months before Ethan came. He collected arrowheads obsessively, building a collection that Ethan helped him organize and display. And he called Ethan Papa, without prompting or explanation, as if the title was simply obvious, beyond question. The mending work continued, growing as Hannah's reputation spread. Women from neighboring ranches began bringing her sewing as well, fancy dresses to alter, quilts to repair, delicate work that required skill and patience. She charged fair prices, saved carefully, and slowly built a small reserve of money that represented security beyond just survival. One evening in late May, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, Hannah leaned against Ethan's shoulder and spoke quietly so the children playing nearby wouldn't hear. "Do you ever think about that night, when the tent collapsed and you rode up out of nowhere?" "Every day," Ethan admitted. "I think about what would have happened if I'd ridden a different direction, if I'd decided to wait out the storm somewhere else. I think about how close you came to—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "But you didn't ride a different direction. You found us. You helped us. You stayed." Hannah took his hand, threading their fingers together. "And now look at us. We have land, a home, a future. We have each other. All because you decided to stop instead of riding past." "You would have survived anyway," Ethan said firmly. "You're too stubborn to die, too determined to let anything stop you from protecting those kids." "Maybe, but surviving isn't the same as living, and you taught us how to do both." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began emerging in the darkening sky. Samuel was showing Abigail constellations, pointing out patterns with the confidence of a child who'd been taught to observe the world carefully. Thomas had fallen asleep on a blanket, his collection of arrowheads clutched in one small fist. "I never thought I'd have this," Ethan said quietly. "A family, a home, a reason to wake up that went beyond just getting through another day. After my sister died, I thought that was it, just work and guilt and trying to make up for what I couldn't fix. But this—" He gestured to the cabin, the children, the land stretching in every direction. "This feels like a second chance, like maybe I didn't fail completely, like maybe I can still do something right." "You've done everything right," Hannah said firmly. "You saved us without making us feel weak. You helped us without making us feel obligated. You loved us before you let yourself be loved back. That's not failing, Ethan. That's being exactly who you are. The best man I've ever known." Ethan pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders, and Hannah felt the complete rightness of this moment. This life they'd built from disaster and determination, from storms survived and battles won, from the simple choice to help and be helped, to trust and be trusted, to love and be loved without reservation or fear. Years later, when Samuel was grown and working his own section of land adjacent to theirs, when Abigail had married a neighboring rancher's son and established her own successful garden business, when Thomas had become a teacher in Cheyenne, but came home every summer with new stories and old arrowheads to add to his collection, Hannah would stand in front of the expanded cabin that had started as desperate shelter and become a family legacy, and remember. She'd remember the night the tent collapsed, the stranger in the storm, the quiet cowboy who'd given them everything while claiming he was just making sense, the fight for land that had become theirs, the transformation from survival to living, from existing to thriving, from alone to family. And she'd remember most clearly that moment when Ethan had appeared through the rain, when she'd been at her lowest and most desperate, when giving up would have been easier than continuing to fight. She'd remember making the choice to trust a stranger, to accept help, to believe that mercy existed even in the hardest places. Because that choice, that single decision in a storm, had led to everything else. To a home built on solid ground, to children who grew up strong and secure, to a love that proved itself through quiet consistency rather than grand gestures, to a life that had started with nothing and became everything that mattered. The Wyoming wind still blew across the plains, constant and relentless. But inside the walls that Ethan had helped make solid, inside the home that Hannah had fought to claim, inside the family they'd built together from storm-racked beginnings, there was warmth and safety and the kind of belonging that turned survival into legacy. And in the end, that was more than enough. It was everything.